Hello, I'm Kamala Emanuel. I'm from Green Left Weekly. I'm here today with Fred Fuentes, and we're going to be speaking about the recent Venezuelan election results. Um, I would like to acknowledge, first of all, before we begin, that we're coming to you from Aboriginal country. So I'm speaking from the land of the Turrbal, the Jagera, the Yagara, and Yagarapul people here in the Anjan, Brisbane, and Fred is speaking to us from Gadigal country in Sydney. So welcome, Fred. Thanks a lot for coming along.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So can I ask you, Fred, to just kick off with a bit of a discussion or just unpacking the background to this Venezuelan election that took place last weekend? Can you talk a bit about our the political and economic and social conditions in Venezuela domestically and its context internationally?
Yeah, well, look, on paper, the elections essentially saw a reversal of the 2015 National Assembly elections. And in 2015, the opposition obtained their first major electoral victory in close to 15 years, obtaining control of the National Assembly. This time around, the 2020 National Assembly elections is seen in the context of a high abstention rate and a large opposition boycott, not a complete. There's some opposition sectors participated in these elections, but a majority boycotted. So a reversal of those results. So this time around, it's the United Socialist Party of Venezuela who will now have control of the National Assembly. But the reality is that probably the biggest difference in terms of what this result will mean will have less to do with the National Assembly itself. For most of since 2015, the National Assembly has essentially been operating outside of the constitutional framework because the opposition has refused to accept some Supreme Court rulings regarding some deputies who were elected under questionable circumstances, and so re-elections were meant to be held. The opposition refused to do that, and so it's essentially not really legislated for the last 5 years. And we've also seen in that context a National Constituent Assembly, which was elected in 2017, operating this one under the control, or with a majority of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, but also has not really legislated much. So we probably won't see a huge difference in that context. Where the biggest impact will be the broader political and potentially economic impacts this will have on Venezuela. Since 2015, the opposition has really used the National Assembly as a springboard for an intensification of its destabilization campaign against the government of President Nicolas Maduro. Up until 2015, it had been, by and large, for the last few years, mainly taking the approach of trying to defeat Chavismo at the ballot box, having narrowly missed out on beating Nicolas Maduro in the 2013 presidential elections, and then, as I said, obtaining a victory in 2015. After that, though, it very much felt that it was on the ascendancy and that now was the time to strike to get rid of Maduro. And so for the last 5 years, we've seen an extreme intensification of political destabilization in Venezuela: coup attempts, assassination attempts, paramilitary incursions, economic warfare. We've seen a deterioration of the economic situation as a result of the international sanctions, which the National Assembly has essentially been going around, or deputies from the old National Assembly have been going around the countries around the world calling for a tightening of the sanctions on Venezuela. So we've seen a political crisis deepening in that country, an economic crisis that has worsened as a result of these economic sanctions. All of this, now the opposition find themselves in a very complex situation, because they've seen 4 or 5 years they've tried to do this. They've tried to worsen the situation in Venezuela with the aim of trying to turn people against the Nicolas Maduro government. And while the turnout for the United Socialist Party of Venezuela certainly saw a decline in its vote, as I said, it's still enough to win these elections. What we've seen on the opposition side is a decline in its support base. Certainly many of its supporters are demoralized by the fact that 5 years ago they were promised that Nicolas Maduro would be gone. And on top of that, their most recent tactic, which was basically dependent on their control of the National Assembly, which was to declare newly elected National Assembly President Juan Guaido, who assumed that role at the start of 2019 as the the interim president for Venezuela, now finds himself basically not even the president of the National Assembly. This is going to be a real challenge for the opposition. Of course, Juan Guaido is still trying to lobby governments around the world to continue to recognize his National Assembly and him as the interim president. He's now asking the international community to basically support a body whose constitutional mandate has clearly expired and who has no intent to actually go to new elections to renovate his democratic mandate. So, of course, many are already starting to question whether they're going to continue to support Juan Guaido. Certainly, European Union, United States have made clear that they don't support the recently elected National Assembly. But certainly in terms of the opposition, we will see an important reconfiguration. And what this means for Venezuela is potentially two things in terms of your question about what's the impact in terms of the political, economic, social conditions in Venezuela. Well, politically, I think it potentially opens up a space for a return to politics through the constitutional framework in Venezuela. With the Maduro government having essentially been able to fight back and resist for 5 years this intense onslaught that's been occurring. And the sense is now that you've already fractured a section of the opposition who participated in these elections, didn't do extremely well, but certainly were able to mobilize a couple of million votes in these elections in a context where the majority of the opposition parties were boycotting. But you're now seeing even a middle section of the opposition, largely represented in many ways by Enrique Capriles, a two-time opposition presidential candidate, saying, look, the time of Juan Guaido, the time of this interim presidency is over. What we need to do now is to fight to ensure that we can create the space possible to be able to win this in the ballot box. And so we will see, hopefully, a return to trying to resolve Venezuela's deep political division, a division that's very much a class-based division, a hatred of the old political class towards Chavismo as a movement of the political poor. An attempt to see, well, look, if the only way that these differences can be resolved is through an electoral framework. So we'll see that may be a potential shift. I think combined with that will, of course, then be the questions of the economic sanctions, because even the opposition is starting to realize that this is a strategy that is backfiring on them 5 years on. Well, many economic sanctions began many years ago in terms of smaller sanctions on military hardware, things like that. But certainly since 2017, we've seen an extreme ratcheting up of these sanctions, and it's really starting to take its toll. So much so that the polls show that even amongst opposition supporters, the majority no longer really support the economic sanctions. They don't see it as working to get rid of Nicolas Maduro. In fact, arguably, it's only strengthening his sort of the strength of his government within Venezuela. And it's having a dire impact on people's everyday lives. So this may also add to a broader, a more united front or a broader pressure from within Venezuela that doesn't just come from the gut side of supporters of the government, but also from a growing section of the opposition to call on particularly the United States, but also European countries to lift these economic sanctions as part of helping to get Venezuela out of the situation that it's currently in.
Yeah, and just thinking about the sanctions and the fact that the European Union and the US haven't recognised the most recent National Assembly elections. What do you make of those forces and international media and their commentary around whether or not this has been a democratic process?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. The real reason that the governments around the world don't want to recognise the new National Assembly is obviously they've been put into this bind, having in many of these cases, claimed that Juan Guaido is the legitimate sort of president of Venezuela. And given that the opposition have basically now said, after having won the 2015 elections or overnight declared no longer were elections legitimate in Venezuela, they've had to sort of been taken down this road of essentially without any evidence or proof. And in fact, in many cases, with outright refusal to send observers to monitor the electoral process in Venezuela. Just basically say, well, look, we've now determined that we're the ones who decide the electoral results. in Venezuela. This is where they're in a bit of a bind, and I think this is why, having seen, the fact that having continued to ignore the election results in the context of an opposition boycott, have seen now that the National Assembly go back to the control of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, that many of these governments will certainly be starting to think, well, we've got to, there must be a different way possible. And I think it has to be added that the US government, and certainly under Trump, has been the spearhead of this campaign to delegitimize, to not recognize. In fact, the evidence has come out that Juan Guaido was in constant contact, not just with US embassy, with US government representatives, but even right up until Mike Pence, who gave him the go-ahead to launch his interim presidency, knowing that the US and also Spain would be the first to immediately come out and recognise him. They've been able to utilise, and certainly in Trump's case, utilise that to basically steal Venezuela's wealth. In terms of Citgo, the PDVSA being the state oil company, Citgo is its affiliate based in the US. The Trump administration used this interim presidency as an excuse to basically expropriate Citgo and hand it over, so expropriate a state-owned company and hand it into the private hands of Juan Guaido and his supporters. So that's one aspect of it. This is why the US has been a big part of spearheading this, of essentially as a way to steal Venezuela's wealth and hand it over to the opposition. And the broader European Union basically coming in behind this strategy, which has meant that even though it's been invited on several occasions to observe elections, has refused to do so. But I think now he's reconsidering how useful this strategy or this tactic of the opposition has been. The other side of it is how the media has reported on all of this. They're essentially accepting as good coin and refusing to point out the fact that it's not been Venezuela who said we don't want international observers. It's the US and the European Union who have fought tooth and nail to stop any kind of international observers going there to be able to monitor these elections. They've been the ones that have been not, trying to undermine Venezuela's electoral authority. This is in a context where the media very often, have been willing to accept any cries of fraud, any cries of illegitimate elections from people in Venezuela. We also saw it last year in Bolivia as well, in a movement that essentially ultimately led to a coup to overthrow a democratically elected president. The media have largely fallen behind this kind of story. What's kind of ironic is that these same figures, these same political forces in Venezuela, as I said, who were pursuing a strategy largely being dictated to them from Washington, a strategy not too dissimilar actually from what Trump has tried to do now in the United States election. And all of a sudden the media has taken the opposite viewpoint of talking about how this is horrific for democracy. The double standards there of the so-called journalism really has to be called out, where they're more than happy to see democracy eroded and destroyed overseas if it suits their political narrative, if it suits their political purposes. More importantly, if it suits the political objectives of governments like the United States and the European Union. But when it comes to the United States and a politician like Trump, who, it's very well known, has had the media establishment have not particularly liked him from day one, more than happy to criticize that. So I think that double standard really has to be called out of the media. As I said, from the government's viewpoint, it's because they've got a political objective. The United States had a political objective. It wants to not just get rid of Nicolas Maduro, but it wants to steal Venezuela's resources. And that's what it achieved by saying it would not recognize Maduro, that it would recognize Guaido and use that as an excuse to expropriate Citgo. We've seen the same happen in Britain with the gold that Venezuela has in the Bank of England, that they've refused to give back to Venezuela to be able to use that to buy the food and medicine it needs to circumvent the sanctions. They do it for political reasons. The media have really just been the covering up for them, basically trying to present a veneer of democracy, really to cover up for what are fundamentally anti-democratic actions that have been taken by the Venezuelan opposition and by its supporters internationally.
And this theft of the gold, of the oil, of the resources of Venezuela, that has had, as you've said, a devastating impact on the people of Venezuela. Can you just unpack a little bit about what has been the economic and social impact and what the ramifications of that have been for politics in Venezuela?
So that, I mean, in terms of the sort of day-to-day impact, it's really hard to sort of, just detail just how much of an impact it's had. Like, of course, we can look at the figures, the fact that after having, really almost possibly led the region in terms of poverty reduction, we've now seen, rising poverty in Venezuela. We've seen Venezuela having gone from a situation where it was where the question of access to food security or access to food had seen a situation where people's calorie intake had surpassed, gone beyond what was, sort of the recommended healthy intake to now once again dropping below that level. So it's had certainly an impact in terms of poverty, in terms of basic indicators like those. It's also had a number of other impacts, and that is that it's just impacted on people's everyday lives. It's just not possible today in Venezuela, as a result of the economic situation in the country, to survive just off your wages. Venezuela's wages, as a result of what's been occurring in the last few years, been totally pulverized. So a monthly wage can at best get you, very, very small amount of the food that you need to not just feed yourself, but feed a family. So when you're not working, you're having to find other ways to make a living, whether that's operating the informal market and doing some kind of side job, whether it's being dependent on remittances coming in from outside the country. So this, it's a daily grind. It's just every day is trying to find that little that what you need to get to the end of the day in order to then wake up the next day and go through this process again. Of course, and this year under COVID, it's been made even harder, where you've had the necessity to impose kind of nationwide lockdowns to deal with the COVID crisis, because Venezuela's health system has also been impacted by the sanctions. So it becomes really difficult, but it also then has its impact on the political sphere, because what it means is that, not only do you not have any real time to do any kind of political activism, and then this has impacted not just the government, but also the opposition. Many opposition supporters just don't have the time to go out to protest, and they're trying to survive day to day. But it's had an impact of basically a society that for many years under Chavez had seen a real growth of collective organization, whether that be the economic sphere, cooperatives, worker-run factories, worker co-managed factories in the state sector, whether that was in the political sphere through community councils, communes that got communities to get together to discuss and debate collectively their issues, their problems, to democratically resolve which ones to tackle. All of this has sort of been heavily impacted as well, because one, there's not that time, and there's that real pursuit of just individual solutions to get out of that, whether that be, as I mentioned, some of the ones that I mentioned before, the informal market, and whether that be trying to somehow make money on, if you live in the border regions, to sell contraband over the border, or whether it's been, as we've seen, large numbers that have just left the country, and many of those cases, people with a lot of skills that they've learned through the expansion of the higher education system in Venezuela, but that have realized that as a professional, they can make much better living than what they can currently do in the current situation in Venezuela. So it has had a very dramatic impact. And this is almost never reported in the media when the discussion is had about what's occurring in Venezuela. The sanctions are at best mentioned in passing, or more commonly just not even part of the conversation. When if you talk to people in Venezuela, the polls constantly show the majority acknowledge A, the sanctions are bad, B, they're having an impact on everyone, C, they want these sanctions lifted. And that's taken a political toll on the opposition as well, who's seen their support wither in some sections because of their open campaigning internationally to maintain the economic sanctions on Venezuela, with really no way out, or no other option than to say, well, the sanctions will remain until Maduro goes, when many don't see that as really a viable strategy as of that happening anytime soon, and instead life just gets harder and harder.
And it sounds like a diabolical set of contradictions. Can you see any way forward? What do you, I mean, at the risk of sounding like just speculation, what options are there for for the working class forces?
Well, I think in terms of the sanctions, I mean, and this goes back to the importance of the National Assembly elections. There's the potential there now for a broader front that's not just the government, but also with opposition forces to actually now lobby to get the sanctions, preferably lifted completely, but certainly at least, some eased, because the opposition forces are realizing that this is not helping their cause. They're losing support amongst their own supporters for being seen to be openly on the side of the sanctions. And given the situation that they're creating in Venezuela, it almost actually sort of has the contradictory impact of what it's meant to do, because the idea is that this was going to turn people against the government. But as I said, the reality is what it's meant is that made everyday life harder, so it's less likely that people are involved in political activism, but also it's in some ways increased the dependency people have on the state, or at least for large sections of the population, dependency they have on the state. For instance, to be able to get the food packages that are provided by the local committees for production and distribution. Those are key food parcels that are given to families all around the country, that are a crucial part of them being able to make it through the end of the month. So the opposition are recognising that this is not helping their cause at all, at least an important section of the opposition. Guaido and the more ultra-right sections seem to be intent on continuing that line. And of course, that's the line they've been pushing now for several years. So it's unlikely perhaps that they will change their tune. But what does seem to be occurring is possibly a shift within the broader section of the opposition to say, look, even we don't support these sanctions anymore. So that will be quite important. And I think that will be quite important, not just for overall the situation in Venezuela, but also for reopening political discussion, because the reality is that we've seen the sanctions have just come to dominate everything in terms of the political discussion, and it means that some of the other broader problems occasionally get put to the side. And of course, this suits those on both sides of politics. So this suits those in the government or in the opposition who don't want to talk about some of these broader issues, and can just, certainly from the government's viewpoint, just simply point to the sanctions as being responsible for everything. And the reality is that there are also key policy issues, key mistakes, key questions that the government needs to deal with as well, and that is part of the reason why, even though government won the elections, the United Socialist Party won majority of the vote, 69% of the vote, in a context of high abstention, but no one's forced to go to vote. That's how the elections work. They work like that in Venezuela. They work like that in every other country. But of course, if all you want to do is have an electoral democracy, then that's fine. That'll be enough to win elections. All you've got to do is win more votes than the opposition. Doesn't matter how many people turn out. But if you want to do as the Venezuelan constitution talks about, and as the Chavista project has always had at its heart, to build a popular, protagonistic and participatory democracy, then you do need people's participation. You can't just rely on or hope that people don't turn up and that enough of your supporters turn up more than the opposition. You need to get society involved. So that's another aspect of why lifting the sanctions will be important, to allow these other discussions to flourish and open up, which can very easily, or whether deliberately or not, be sort of shut down by the question of, we can't resolve anything until we resolve the economic sanctions first.
And I think that connects too a bit with a phenomenon you discussed in one or two of your recent articles in Green Left on the Venezuelan elections, with this emergence of I believe it's the APR, a revolutionary current that stood against the PSUV. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, look, the formation of the Popular Revolutionary Alternative, the APR, was pretty significant. Not in terms of the vote that it achieved. In the end, it got 3% of the vote, or just shy of 3%. It got one deputy elected to the National Assembly. But I'm not sure if that was really, the electoral sphere was going to be the biggest impact it was going to have. The reality is that what it did represent, though, was the first time that a number of political parties, social movements, trade union groupings, they kind of said, look, we actually need to get together and start to reorganize our forces in amongst the popular classes, because whilst many of them would have different appreciations of the Maduro government, or the role that Nicolas Maduro has played, and I think many of them would certainly acknowledge that the ability to still be there after 5 years of intense destabilization campaign is the strong point of the Maduro government. But many are conscious that this has come at a political cost. This has come at concessions to the opposition, and it's come at concessions to more right-wing conservative forces within the Socialist Party. And so there's a sense of, well, we need to organise our side of the forces to not just to help the Maduro government stay in power, but to reorientate it, to get back on the direction where the sort of Chavista forces wanted to take Venezuela, this history protagonistic democracy, this what they referred to as 21st century socialism. So this was important. It potentially opened a discussion, only potentially, because it's only just started. It's only been around for a few months, and we'll have to see. I think there are, of course, many dangers. Well, not dangers, but challenges that the APR will face. It's have to grapple with the reality, and the elections showed that majority of Chavistas still support the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, whether they have their criticisms or not. The APR weren't able to get traction on the electoral sphere, neither amongst the hardcore of the PSUV, who pretty much, by and large, turned out to vote for the PSUV. The election result, if we consider that 30% turned out and 2/3 of those who turned out voted PSUV, we're looking at roughly 20% of the electoral roll. That's roughly what the polls show support PSUV. So we had pretty much a 100% turnout, or very, very high level of turnout of the hardcore supporters of the PSUV. But of course, to win elections, and traditionally Chavismo has a role on much more than just its hardcore supporter, and it's been able to engage 40, 50, 60% of the population in other electoral contexts. So the APR wasn't really able to make inroads into that hardcore of the PSUV or into that broader section. So it needs to consider how it's able to continue to generate the debate that it started. I think the biggest mistake it could do is to just think that the way it's going to move forward is simply by criticising, but this time from the left, the government. I think that's unlikely to really gain a hearing. But what it can do is to start to open up a discussion on some of these other questions that some in the PSUV would prefer to just be deferred or not discussed at all until after the sanctions, or after, no doubt, after something else is discovered later on as being an obstacle to being able to continue the process of radicalisation that had occurred ever since really the Chavez's election in 1998 and for the last 20 years, but which for the last years has seen a sharp reversal, and not just in terms of the economic situation, but also this process of radicalisation of democracy in Venezuela.
Yeah, look, I think that has been probably for, left-wing observers from Australia or other parts of the world who are sympathetic to the revolution, the process of democratisation, of participation with what you referred to, the communes and the neighbourhood committees, the whole concept of a protagonist citizenship has been one of the really inspiring elements of the revolution. And what you described about the challenges faced just by the sanctions is obviously really concerning. So I guess it's just to be hoped that there is a way forward, that the sanctions can be lifted or at least eased, and that there is more room again for I guess that breathing space for the democratic forces to reorganise. Is there anything else you think that we should be paying attention to in the coming period?
Yeah, and I think just to add to that last point, and this would be the view not just of people of the APR, but I'm sure, I know it's the view of also of members of people who still remain as members of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, that their concern is that not just that the impact of the sanctions are having on this sort of process of politicization of society, of radicalization of democracy, not just the sanctions, but also how the sanctions are being used by the conservative elements in the PCV to sort of wind them back with the aim of probably potentially just really hoping to get back to a kind of the way the old two-party system operated in Venezuela. The difference this time around would be that the PSUV would be one of those parties. So that would still represent a shift from before, because before you just had basically COPE, the Social Christian Party, and Acción Democrática, the Social Democratic Party, both representing the traditional political class. They alternated amongst themselves. The vast majority of the poor were totally excluded from politics, had no representation whatsoever. And PSUV today, still continues to represent that, even if it also may represent other class forces as well. But certainly that it's the party that the majority of the poor in Venezuela, the working classes in Venezuela see as their vehicle. But I think many see this as stake is that maybe there'll be some in the PSUV that'd be happy to just move back to a two-party system. PSUV now being the major party, that might mean sometimes they lose elections. But that process of the radical democratization of society, we actually move beyond just representation, but to actual participatory democracy, is very much at stake. And it's a constant battle. It's constantly coming up, and we see it coming up more and more with questions of how to deal with the economic sanctions while the economic sanctions remain. So, for instance, how do you, if you desperately need private investment in the country to try and turn around the economic situation, which I think almost everyone would agree is required in some form. There might be a debate about whether there is any private investment that is interested in investing in Venezuela at the moment, given the economic situation. But I don't think anyone would say they were against that. But then, of course, what conditions are required to do that? Does that mean having to roll back some of the economic measures undertaken by the Chavez government? Does that mean having to, in some cases, give back companies or land that have been nationalised, expropriated, handed over to communities, to workers? All of these are the questions that are sharpening, becoming sharper, and I think it's what has led to the formation, or in part has led to the formation of the APR. But as I said, it's not a discussion that can just be reduced to the APR. It's a discussion that goes much broader than just the APR. And so what will be interesting to see is how on the one hand, these elections, the ramifications, the impact it will have on the opposition, and the potential, at least, for a sort of a moderate shift in the opposition towards the realization that there has to be some kind of electoral participation as a way forward, and perhaps a combined campaign to ease the sanctions on Venezuela. It'll be interesting to see what the broader ramifications will be amongst the base of Chavismo, who run the risk of, so I think I wrote in an article after the Maduro elections in 2018 of, continuing to win battles, but at the same time losing the war. And I think that's potentially what we could be seeing, occurring in Venezuela, where the Maduro government might still be there, but the reality is that the economic sanctions have had such an impact where they've essentially forced the Maduro government to implement the kind of policies that in many cases the opposition would be quite happy to implement in the economic sphere. So this is a real challenge, I think, bind that Venezuela finds itself in, and why, to get back to the purpose of the interview, why the National Assembly elections were so important, because they will have an impact going forward on the opposition side of politics. And I'm pretty certain they will also have an impact going forward on the PSUV or the left side of politics, irrespective of the actual vote that occurred in the elections itself, or the exact composition of the National Assembly.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Fred, thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts with us today. We might just leave it there and just look forward to these developments as they continue.
Fantastic. It was very much enjoyed it.
Okay. Thanks, Fred.